Hello, it's Gill Fielding here, and this is what's caught my eye in the media this week. I've been absolutely intrigued by this shall we go back to work in the office or work from home debate, because for me personally, I'd be back in the office like a shot because I want the sense of community and sociability and connection that provides. But I know that this is a double-edged sword here, and some people do want to go back to the work in the office and some people don't. But there were some interesting statistics announced this week, which suggest that the debate about whether to go back into the office or not is more about where the office might be rather than the specific office environment. So there was an analysis of the footfall of this year compared to last year when the pandemic started. And it turns out that places like Glasgow, for example, the footfall is only 9% of what it was. In major cities like Manchester, London, Leeds, it's about 15% of what it was. And yet if you go out to the suburbs and you go to places like sunny Brighton, Brighton is up to about 47% of its previous footfall already. So it got me to thinking that I think one of the reasons people don't want to go back to work is because they might have to commute, because all the major cities, particularly London, for example, the footfall is still quite low. And I think people would much rather work from home than have to hang on a strap for an hour to get into the office. So I think it's probably more to do with the commuting and the travel and the lack of parking and all those other frustrations rather than the office environment itself, because it transpires that in all of the rural towns rather than the big cities, footfall is already quite high because they're nicer places to work in some ways. So I think that's one of the reasons. The other thing that I'm starting to get a bit interested in is what's going to happen if people don't go back to work in London, for example. Are they then going to use what's called the London waiting allowance, the additional pay that you get for working in a place like London? Because if you're working from home, you don't need the London allowance, do you? So that's going to be an interesting debate that I think will follow fairly soon. Be interesting to see how that turns out. I also read this week a lovely piece of research done by Credit Suisse, which shows that actually the rich always get richer. And apparently there have been another 5.2 million millionaires created effectively over the last year, bringing the total number of millionaires worldwide to 56.1 million. There were some fascinating pieces of information in the research. First of all, about the increase in millionaires per se, which is interesting. But Credit Suisse identified that the vast majority of that wealth and the increase in wealth came from what we at Fielding Financial know, the wealth motorway, which is being invested in property, being invested in shares or stocks, and being invested in businesses. Because those things over the pandemic have done pretty well. I mean, particularly property and shares, for example. And it just highlighted the difference between how the wealthy cope with their money and how the not wealthy cope with their money. Because the wealthy take responsibility for their money themselves, and they create their own private economy, which they invest in things like property and shares and so on, where they're getting at least say a 10% return on their money. And of course their money grows when you're doing that. For those people that don't take control of their money and they just abdicate it to the governmental public economy, well, there's generally not much growth there, because GDP, the economic growth, is predicted to be normally about 1 or 2%, and inflation is normally predicted to be about 1 or 2%. So if you're relying on the public economy, probably your money won't be going anywhere. So it just goes to show the rich get richer because they take control of their own personal economy. They don't leave it to others. And they invest in things that they know will grow by an average of about 10% per year. And that's why they get rich. And that's all there is to it. So everybody could do it if they just learned those two simple lessons. Now, finally, I'm a huge football fan, as you probably already know, so I'm glued to the TV every afternoon and evening watching all the football matches. But there were two interesting pieces of news that came out this week about the football. First of all, 2/3 of COVID cases, I think, in Scotland were from 15 to 44-year-old males. And the estimation, the guess is that this is happening, this large number of cases in fairly young men, is coming because they're gathering together to watch the football, and obviously densely connected together, and obviously then COVID cases break out. So we're seeing a high number of COVID cases in what we suspect are football watchers. But on the other side of that particular coin, there's a really piece of good news in that it's boosting the hospitality industry and the hospitality trade, because these gatherings of football fans are buying beer and food and drink of all sorts. So it's actually boosting trade for pubs, restaurants, hospitality industry when they desperately need that boost. So there's a negative and a plus to the football. So you've got to decide which side of the fence you want to fall on. And I'm a passionate football supporter. So my summation of all of that is, come on, England, let's keep the football going. I'll speak to you next week.